Hi, friend. Welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am so glad that you are tuning in and taking a listen to the show today. In this episode, you're going to hear a replay from one of my favorite conversations that we have had on the show over the past 5 years. In choosing this episode, I was sure to choose one that I felt personally challenged by and that I believe will inspire and encourage you in your leadership journey. Now, it's possible you heard this episode when it first came out, but that might have been a couple years ago, and you might still benefit from taking a second listen. Or perhaps you're brand new to the show. This is the first time you're listening, and I invite you to just go ahead, tune into this episode, and then go back and find others that you feel might resonate with you and where you're at right now. Now, I want to invite you to connect with me outside of the show. If you enjoyed this conversation today and you want to connect, head over to Instagram. That's where I spend most of my time in terms of social media currently. And you can send me a DM. My username is Esther D. Littlefield. Just send me a DM, introduce yourself, let me know you listen to the show, and I would love to connect with you. All right, friend, let's dive in to our conversation today.
Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend, and welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and today I am excited to share with you an episode that Holly and I did with our guest, Terra Mattson. One issue that we are seeing in the world of Christian leadership today is that of integrity. We see prominent leaders who have large followings, and all of a sudden, something is revealed, and then we realize that they were not who we thought they were. And while this can seem like an issue that might not affect us, that it only affects, those people over there, the truth is that every one of us needs to make sure that we are living in integrity, that we are in alignment with the way we are living our lives and what we are saying we believe and we are preaching to those around us or teaching to those around us. So in our conversation with Terra, she shares with us why the issue of integrity gaps is so important. We talk about what does integrity gap mean, why it impacts us, and what are some of the common symptoms that would help us to know if we have particular integrity gaps. And we also talk about one symptom that might impact women more than men. In addition, we dive into the importance of having safe people, how to find a counselor if you need one, and what to do if you're sensing an integrity gap in someone else's life. Finally, we also cover why we as women must speak up, especially in settings where we might be in the minority. So I know you're going to love this conversation and get so much out of it. Holly and I felt like we could talk to Terra for much longer, but we also wanted to share this episode as soon as possible because it's a perfect follow-up to the issue of vulnerability that we talked about in episode 120. And this topic of integrity just is completely a great follow-up to that conversation. So before we dive in, I want to let you know that Terra wrote the book Shrinking the Integrity Gap along with her husband, Jeff. And that book just came out in the month of October 2020. And they are actually offering a free audiobook for anyone who purchases the physical book before October 31st. So if you head over to their website, livingwholehearted.com, you can get all the details, and it may or may not actually be the physical book. Go get all the details, check it out, buy the book, and then grab the free audiobook as well. So to get the show notes, to get the links that we talk about, all the resources that are mentioned in this episode, go to estherlittlefield.com/podcast. You can scroll down, see the latest episodes. You can also do a search on my website. Anytime you need to find an episode, you can just search for it, as well as every episode gets listed as estherlittlefield.com/episode and then the episode number. So as I'm recording this, I'm not sure exactly what episode number this is going to be, but head over to the website to get the show notes when you need them. All right, friend, thank you for being here, and let's go ahead and dive in to our conversation with Terra Mattson. All right, welcome, Terra, to the podcast. We are so excited to have you here with us today. And to get us started, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do right now?
Absolutely. I am married to my husband and business partner, ministry life partner. We do pretty much everything together. His name's Jeff Mattson. And we have two daughters, 11 and 13. And I wear many, many hats, as most women leaders do. I'm the clinical director of our counseling practice. We started an organization that does professional counseling and professional executive coaching on the 360 of a person, a wholehearted. So it's called Living Wholehearted. We're outside of Portland, Oregon. We're all the way on the West Coast.
Yeah.
The hub of quite a bit of emerging issues. And so I'm the clinical director. I oversee our counseling practice. We've got many mental health providers. And then I also started something called Courageous Girls. And it is a mom-daughter organization. That's a global organization. We provided free curriculum that helps moms walk through every issue that their daughter needs to address at the right time in their life, from second grade all the way through high school. So I oversee that and our coaches and help equip leaders there as well. And that's just a few of our hats.
Awesome. So I'm going to have to look into the Courageous Girls thing. Like, yeah. I need that. My daughter's about to turn 12, so we have all the issues.
Yes. MyCourageousGirls.com. It's all there. We try to just seriously everything you need so you can just start from scratch. So.
Awesome.
Do you have one for boys? Because I'm a boy. Could I read it and maybe use some of this stuff?
Oh, I love it. You know what? That is the number one question I get. And I go, well, God hasn't given us that mission quite yet. But I would say that a lot of boy moms are using the book Courageous, as well as some of the curriculum, because when it comes to processing emotions and different things like that, boys need that as well. It's just the body changes, right? That's where it's more unique.
I'll let his father handle that. So I would love for you to kind of walk us through your leadership journey, maybe when you realized you were a leader and how that's evolved over time.
Yeah. It's interesting. I look back, I always tell people I was mute till high school, meaning I just was quiet. I observed a lot as a young girl. There's a lot of reasons. I think it's my wiring, but I also think it's just kind of the phase of life in my family of origin. And then something happened in high school where I started practicing using my voice. And it was real quick that mentors started grabbing me and putting me in positions of leadership. And so most of the time there's that imposter syndrome of like, why me? But early on, I could look back and see how God had a plan for me to be one who was leading and shepherding others. So it really started in high school, going to the point of, running for student council and captain of sports teams and things like that just were a little more natural, moving into full-time ministry. But I remember one mentor specifically who took me by the face, literally, and looked me in the eyes and says, you love well, you need to do this at every place that you go. And it was a way of shaping the way I led that was really clear to me. So both kind of just looking at my life experience, you go, this is what I'm meant to do. And then usually when you look behind you and you see people following you, you're probably a leader. And so it didn't happen intentionally. I've never sought it out intentionally. And I'm sure a lot of women can resonate with that. It's not been an ambition of mine. It's just been something that God continues to do in my life.
I love that. That is something that we hear from a lot of the women in our audience and even a lot of our guests, that it was kind of like, okay, I guess this is what you want me to do, God. Like, you kind of stuck me in this role and now I need to steward it well. I need to invest in learning and growing and really becoming a stronger leader. So I love that. And I love that you had a mentor who was so specific in your journey that helped you to see that. So it's powerful. So, Terra, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show is to talk about the issue of integrity. And it's something that even just in the news the past few weeks, it seems like every day we're hearing about leaders and even Christian leaders whose secret lives are exposed. And we find ourselves shocked and we find ourselves sometimes devastated by the information that a pastor or a leader, has been living a double life or has some kind of scandal, unfortunately, that is revealed. And there's a disconnect between what they were preaching on the outside, what they were teaching, what they were saying, versus how they were actually living their inner lives. So, I think that this topic of integrity is just vital and essential for us as leaders to be aware of and to be diving into. So could you just start us off by telling us how you define integrity and why you feel it's so important for us to be talking about that right now?
Absolutely. Well, the heart of living wholehearted is helping leaders live with integrity. That is our little tagline. It's our mission statement. And whether you are leading the most important organization on the planet, the family, and you are a parent, you have a following, all the way to us ministry leaders, CEOs, anywhere that you're leading, you have a following, and how you lead matters. And a lot of times of what we share is that who you are is more important than actually what you do. And we have a paradigm, both in performance-based Christianity, where we think we're doing something for God. It starts to divide our lives pretty quickly, where we go do the dutiful thing, but internally our lives are a mess and we ignore it quite a bit. And so I've had the privilege in the counseling office for the last 15 years. I've been working with leaders and seeing the division, seeing how every Sunday teaching or the Bible study leader or running a nonprofit for helping sex trafficked women, all these things that we do and we love to do for Jesus, but then really battling those internal worlds. And so that confidential space has given me a chance to really see what is happening. And we've found that there's a connection, that a lot of us leaders are such high performers that we get just kind of shuffled down the line with applause and way to go. And I just remember at one point in my journey, it was probably in my early 20s, I just thought, I've been leading all this time. People get to meet me and then they put me in a position, but they never really hear my story. They never really ask me about what's going on. How do I feel? Because most leaders are fine. And that is a system that is creating a division in a lot of our lives. And it's partly our fault as leaders by not slowing down and doing our work. And it's partly the system's fault, particularly in the church, who is just applauding the outside and not really taking the time and energy to do the inner work. And so it's sadly a commonplace, and why we are so passionate to say, let's get our baggage down to carry-on size before we really have our big titles or our influence is far greater, because that's when we start to see the headlines. It damages. And we always say, a leader who's living with integrity benefits anyone in their wake. But if they don't do their work, at some point, someone's going to pay, and it's going to be them and everybody who's following them. So it will leak at some point. And so it's a passion. It's what we dedicate our entire life to, hence the book we just wrote.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I find what a paradox, right? Like at the church, we talk about being this hospital for hurting people that can really sort of get the healing that they need. And we as leaders are sort of touting that. And then so many of us are really not doing the work that we need to do in the healing that we need to get. So it's such an interesting paradox.
So true. And such a great point that I think, when you stop and pause, it kind of feels like a catch-22.
Yeah.
But at the same time, here's the paradigm that I try to sit under and we work with our leaders on is we are leading in the way we go, no matter what we're doing. And so if we think that by us being strong and okay all the time, that is telling our people something.
Exactly.
And if we're living a divided life, especially our children can see it, but eventually those that are following us will see it and can tell. And it's hard because we don't want to be vulnerable to the masses. I do warn against that. That is something that's very dangerous and I think very valued in our current culture of just tell everybody everything. But we do need to have, it's not wise. It's just not wise.
No, it's not.
But we do need to have a small circle of people who know us outside of our leadership role. I call these people, these are my people who know me as Terra, just Terra. And I can be raw and I can vent and they're not going to see me any different, nor do they need anything from me. These are the people that are loving me as me. And a lot of us leaders, we just don't have that. And so that is one of the essentials to helping build our integrity and being wholehearted is starting with those 2-3 people, but not the masses. I don't think it's wise to always just every time we're standing up to share where we currently are in the middle of our mess. It's not loving our people either that are following us as well. So,
right. We actually just talked about that on the podcast, episode 120 we did about vulnerability. And we talked about how leaders need to have vulnerability, but also how we shouldn't like emotionally vomit over our entire leadership, circles of people. We need those safe people that we can share with. So I love that this is totally in alignment with what we just talked about.
Yeah. So your book is called Shrinking the Integrity Gap, which I love, by the way. It's such a mental picture. I would love for you to explain what you mean by the phrase integrity gap.
Absolutely. Well, if you could see my hands, I would be holding them apart and I'd say it's shrinking the gap between what we say on one side and how we actually live. And nobody does that perfectly but Jesus Christ. And so there's this humility and grace to know, okay, I'm in the human race and I struggle, but it is a noble pursuit to shrink that gap. And as leaders, the word calls us to a higher responsibility. We just do as shepherds. And we see that throughout the scriptures. We talk about that. And leadership is not something to be sought after because it is a hard job. And so if God's given us that mantle, it's a responsibility to really lead from the inside out, not the outside in. And so shrinking that gap is literally bringing those hands together and trying to get it's a lifestyle of looking and going, okay, what's my mantras these days that I'm teaching those that I'm leading? And how's it going for me? So that it's not I did it, I arrived. It's a continual process of leading with integrity and being willing to get feedback, being willing to hear from the Lord, being willing to let my inner circle to kind of say, hey, Terra, I think you're getting a little off right there. Or I just heard your podcast and you said that, but you're not doing that right now. So honey, what do we need to work on? Okay. It's just that gentle, loving grace that God has so that we don't feel all of a sudden we wake up and the gap is so large, it's overwhelming to start. And that I know many who are listening, they feel like their gap is so large, but God just takes us right where we're at and he just needs a willing heart to say, help me shrink it.
So many things you said I want to talk about. One of the things I was thinking about that kind of rung true with me, and we talked about this a lot at the very beginning of our podcast, is self-awareness. And it seems like that really is a huge part of this, is figuring out where your gap really is and how big it truly is. And that takes a certain amount of self-awareness. So I'd love for you to talk about the risk when leaders don't actually see those gaps and don't actively work to address them.
Oh, we've got a whole book unpacking that because it's enormous. And I think that's why I think a lot of leaders aren't given here's the list of risks. We're just kind of told, actually we're told here's the task, go do it, because there's just so many urgent needs that we don't have time. And so having margin and rhythms and time is so vital, but the risk is enormous. Let me just throw out a principle that we built on from years of our research and the work that we're doing. And it's from our personal lives as well. So when I say this, it's also about me. Most high capacity leaders have trauma in their stories. Most high capacity leaders would say, I don't have a hard story. They have a hard story. What trauma? I had a happy childhood. Now, that is the number one thing every trauma survivor says. I had a happy childhood. When you start to become aware of your own pain and your own struggle, it is hard. There's a grieving process, and humanity, all humans don't want to feel pain. And we have all these crazy coping strategies, some of them more acceptable than others. And leadership is an acceptable coping strategy. Achievement, performance, being able to get all the things on your list checked off. And so it is easy to hide behind doing good and serving others, especially in the church. We are applauded for who we serve and how many nonprofits we started and all kinds of things like that. And though it is amazing what God does through his broken people, eventually the risk is this: all that credibility that you built for years can get broken in a matter of seconds, just a matter of seconds. Mm. And so all this good that you did really just not only hurts you and your immediate community, but every single person that ever was touched. And I so get angry that that's the way it is, but it's the reality of being in human relationships for such a time as this. And so everybody is watching us, and more than ever before in the digital world, they're really watching us. Yeah. So, yeah. Mm. But I would say it's also God's grace when we start to become self-aware. And I think there's a beautiful gift in being able to stay grounded and sober about our own humanity. And then also to recognize, look at what God does despite me. And it is that paradox you were talking about earlier. But the warnings are huge. And we just say, anywhere you're at, if you're early in the journey of leadership, all the way to you've been seasoned, it's time to start now. Now.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, Terra, in your book, you go through 10 different symptoms of a personal integrity gap and kind of these warning signs, I think, that we can see. So could you we probably don't have time to talk about all 10, but could you talk about a few of them that are the most common and that might trip up a lot of leaders in their lives?
Absolutely. Well, that's not an exhaustive list. It's just some of the most common. And I would say maybe let's speak to the current times, just with world pandemic, isolation. So we talk about that. Prior to the world pandemic, isolation is one of the large warning signs that we see in leaders. And the larger your influence, the more isolated you get. It's kind of the nature of leadership. And so we have to work really hard and prayerfully consider, who can I trust at every level of leadership? Just even the dynamics of dual relationships, right? Let's say you're working side by side with a colleague and all of a sudden you get promoted. There's levels of confidentiality and things that you're holding from an organizational standpoint that now you can't share with your colleague that was also your best friend from college. I mean, so there's all these dynamics. So that isolation starts to build and you start to feel like, oh no, I'm alone. Who can I? And as women, I will just say, it feels even more isolating the higher level of leadership. It starts to become where more of the women who are holding this level of influence with me. That's not a statement. It's just kind of just a reality of where things are right now. So isolation, burnout is another one. We start to look at getting tasks and efficiency are the priority rather than really taking care and listening to our bodies, listening to where our own souls are, not losing sight of our first love. Those are kind of the two largest. And I'm going to throw a side one in there that we talk about narcissism. I think that leaders have a spectrum of narcissism. It's a continuum. And there are true NPDs in the leadership world within the church. And I think we need to be aware of that. And we tend to promote them pretty quickly because they're charismatic and very talented and woo people, but they do a lot of damage and abuse. But we all have a little bit of the narcissistic continuum. So it's important for us to just look at it, get some feedback, keeping ourselves sober in our perspective of ourselves.
For those who aren't familiar, Terra, could you just define NPD?
Yeah, narcissistic personality disorder. And so we kind of throw that term around like, oh, they're narcissists. But a true NPD is somebody that is arrested at the age of 2 and they see the world. Everything is always about them. They have no empathy. And you just start to see how that takes place over time and destroys an organization and a whole system. But they draw a lot of people who are hungry for leadership. And then we find that it ends up being a really unhealthy, abusive system down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love talking about this because I think that these are great sort of red flags, if you will, for people, especially if they are not self-aware. They can start to see these things in themselves. Our podcast generally is geared towards women, and I'm wondering if there's a specific symptom that you think more likely affects women than men, or do you think it's pretty much equal men to women on these symptoms?
Well, that's a great question. And I can't really speak from formal data, but I can speak from the survey data from the work that I do. And I work with both men and women. I love working with women. And I'll just say that my experience, my personal experience, particularly being in the church, I was on staff for a long time in a leadership role. Most of the time, it's me and a bunch of men. And my upbringing added to this is what we talk about is our stories are playing a role. But the survival chapter that my needs don't matter or my needs are a sign of weakness can be a real struggle for us women because we might see our emotions or the way God designed us as a weakness and not a contribution. And for years, I dismissed the things I was feeling or, everybody in the room is excited about something and my discernment's going way off. And I'm thinking, am I just, do I not have enough faith but dismissing ourselves and our emotions and our own needs, I think can be a little bit more common for a lot of women, just especially in the church, depending on what systems you're in. But it's hard to be in a room with a bunch of men who maybe are bent more on a cognitive level. They have feelings too, but the way God designed our female brains is that we're a little bit more integrated between our emotions and our cognitive space. It's actually a beautiful thing. But as leaders, we dismiss it a lot. And that leaks in all kinds of physical ailments, stomach aches, irritable bowel syndrome, all kinds of things that we just think is a side note, anxiety. It's actually related to dismissing our own needs and desires and taking good care of ourselves.
Yeah, that's helpful. I can't wait. Like I've got this book and I just can't wait to read the whole thing because there's just so much good stuff here. And one of the chapters that stood out to me as I was looking at things is the issue of escapism and compartmentalization. That's a long word. But could you speak a little bit to that particular symptom and how that might look for somebody in their life and maybe some of the warning signs with that integrity gap?
Absolutely. Well, particularly in that chapter, we talk about how it's easy to go to work or places of influence and everybody loves you and then come home and be like, why does my husband not see who I am and value me when everyone else is thinking they're hearing me, or my kids? And it's that disconnect of being a workaholic. Compartmentalizing and being disintegrated comes from years and years and years of practicing dismissing who we are as a person and just focusing on our tasks and finding our identity apart from who God says we are and more in what we do. So it's this performance-based drive. So we really unpack that. We actually unpack a little bit more that it's even more common among millennial generation because of the nature of the generations. There's a lot of research that's come out. So that's been a fascinating piece that we put in there. And I think it's important for millennials to just be more aware that compartmentalizing is happening even more.
Right.
Did I answer your question, Esther?
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So I know you kind of already alluded to this, but you talked about this issue of trauma. And I know you mentioned that your research has shown that there's this link between high-performing leaders, which a lot of women listening are in that category, and the issue of trauma. And that unresolved trauma lies at the root of a lot of people's integrity gaps. So could you just expand on that a little bit and tell us, what does that look like? How can a leader know if there's unresolved trauma that might be impacting their integrity?
Absolutely. Well, again, like I said, trauma survivors often are like, what trauma? That's the first stage. Like we don't see it. We don't connect the dots because we're so used to disconnecting from our pain. And when a leader disconnects from their own pain, they're disconnecting from the pain of those they lead as well. You cannot dive into the trenches and have that empathy and compassion at the level that you can when you've done your own work and you know your own story and you've grieved your own pain. And when I use the word trauma, I mean anything that's out of the ordinary. So it could be anything from an earthquake happening and destroying my house, to my parents got divorced, to sexual abuse. And that right there for women is extremely high. 1 in 3 women have been sexually abused. And most would say that, no, that wasn't abuse. But when you look at the definitions and the impact it has on us, it is abuse. Emotional, verbal, physical abuse is common in a lot of high capacity leaders. And what that does for us is it teaches us my needs don't matter, your needs matter, and I do everything I can to keep from feeling that pain. Hence, I make a really great leader because I can handle really high stress. I mean, those of us that grew up in any sort of like alcoholic, dysfunctional family, I pretty much named most people if I said dysfunctional family. But there's a baseline that says, I don't feel, I don't trust, and I don't need anything. And therefore, I'm a really good caretaker of everybody in my wake. And so the trauma piece that trained us very young plays a really solid role. I think God uses it. I always think of the Israelites in Egypt and the things that they learned in their trauma served them later on. And when they were out in the wilderness, they had skill sets and things that they learned in those really difficult places of slavery. And yet there's things that God wants to redeem and say, you don't need that anymore. You don't need to keep grumbling or you don't need to keep, the trusting God is harder and harder. So we tend to take it on ourselves, be can-do people. So if we don't address this part of our earlier story, we aren't able to understand some of those things that we're struggling with today. And that sounds very counselor-like. And in the church, I get it a lot. What's the point of the past? Look at Paul. He says, press on towards the prize. I don't look back. And I go, well, that's out of context. You forgot that Paul, he grieved and processes so much of his story. He talks about his upbringing into being a Pharisee and the murderer. I mean, he is grieving a lot of different other places when he says that. It's not, it just is gone. He's given God all of who he is, and you hear it in all of his writings. So it makes him more able to really hang in the hard, but with honesty and not with, oh, it's no big deal. We got this. So that is common for us leaders until all of a sudden we literally had a woman come in. She couldn't move her body. She had to have somebody drive her. And her body just gave up on her. She had been pressing for so long. And when we really got down to it and processed her story, she was blown away by the pain that she had growing up in her home and never really was acknowledged and was always the caretaker, and made a really great leader later in life, but really sent her for a loop of 2 years of recovery from a major burnout.
Wow. Oh, my mind is like going a million miles an hour as I listen to you talk about this. So you talked about the symptoms of the issues of the integrity gap. And there might be someone listening that has recognized that there's an issue or identifying themselves in some of the things that you're saying. So I'd love for you to talk about how or what people can do next to shrink that gap, or maybe even just what's the first step?
Absolutely. Well, the good news is that each chapter, we did give you some antidotes and some things that you can start to do. So we didn't just name the problems. We said, here's some things that you can start working on. And let me be the first to confess that I think while I was writing this book, I was really wrestling with chapter 9, the burnout chapter. As I was writing it, I had to come face to face with, here I am preaching something and I'm not living this. So I actually took a sabbatical from my counseling practice because of writing this chapter. So it's this ongoing process of listening to the still small voice of God and not ignoring those warning signs within us or the voices of our family. When my girls are telling me, Mom, and we've given our children a voice, which I think is healthy, but Mom, you're kind of irritable or a lot, or you're on your phone a lot. Those are the things that you start, and I might get defensive and say, well, you don't understand all the things I have to do. And da, 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 and I think, oh, it's going to get better, but it never gets better until I really start to put it into practice here now. Yeah. But If you're overwhelmed by everything I'm saying, that's normal. Just want to say that to the audience. Step one is God meets us right where we're at. He does the work. And that's the grace in this book, is he does the work if we let him. There's a key word, permission. We have to let him. And so a lot of times we're like, Lord, you can have this part of me, but you can't have this part of me. And I don't want to go there. I've already addressed that. I've been in counseling for 3 years already. We're done. Those kinds of things that we say to him. And he gently just says, okay, when you're ready. So first step, give him permission. And second step, start with someone who's safe and start talking about it. So either it's a close friend, a mentor, a counselor, a spiritual director. That's a good starting point. And to have a guide to walk with you. Because to do this journey alone just puts us in that isolation chapter. So it doesn't really help it. You need to have one other person at least walking with you.
I love that. So this kind of just lines right up to the next question I wanted to ask you is, you're talking about finding somebody to be open with and honest with. And again, Holly and I just talked about vulnerability on a recent episode and how that is so important to have. But so many of us struggle with doing that, with finding that safe person or people, and also actually being honest about our struggles, honest about where we're at. So why do you think this is so hard for us? And then how can we take some steps to change that?
Oh, great question. And I actually speak a little bit more specifically to women in the book Courageous, Being Daughters Rooted in Grace. And I talk a lot about our female, that it starts with Adam and Eve, that competitive nature, that comparison nature that we have as women. And so there's this thing called vulnerability hangover. Did you guys talk about that? Where if you share and all of a sudden you feel that icky feeling of oh my gosh, I can't believe I just told you all that.
We didn't talk about that, but yeah, that is a real thing.
It's a real thing. It feels like you just threw up and you let somebody see all the grossness of you. And now what? You have to go there and then see what happens after before you're willing to do it again. And it's baby stepping it. It's why I actually became a therapist. I was in ministry for years, and I just recognize there's this barrier that we all have. And dual relationships can damage that. And what I mean by dual relationships is, in the church, you're not only my friend, you're my brother and sister in Christ, you're my boss, you're my children's nanny. I mean, we combine way too many relationships. And so when you know one part of me, it can impact every single part of my life. So learning to have someone that is just, this is my vomit person. They're trusted. And so as a counselor, I'm often the person that starts with that with someone and then help them move out, and we practice with one or two. But God's got a woman in your life. If you're listening, he has someone who's already there, and you have to take the risk. I'm going to say one more dorky. It's really dorky, but I think I remember practicing this in my early 20s. And I actually was like, Lord, who am I supposed to practice with? Because I don't share my feelings very well. I don't trust very well. I'm a very honest person, and people would think, oh my gosh, I bet you tell us everything. Nope. That was kind of the conviction at the time. I struggled with an eating disorder for years, and people had no clue, right? So I know what it was like to hide. And I remember going to 2 women. God said, I want you to choose these 2 women. I'm like, I don't know about them. Can they do it? Can they hold me? Am I going to be too much? All of that stuff, right? And I actually said out loud to them, will you be my vulnerability practice friends? I think I did that. But I said it out loud, and they said yes, not knowing what that meant. And here we are, fast forward all these years, but it took years to feel like I actually trusted it. So it takes time and consistency, and it takes our initiation. And I really do think that there are women in our life if we're willing to risk it. And it also means that you'll get burned. There will be people that hurt you, and that's part of the risk. And I look at Jesus and I go, well, he did say that, didn't he? So I'm not surprised. Why am I surprised? But it does mean you might get hurt, and that's okay. I would rather have integrity and be honest and have a few who know all of me than nobody that knows none of me, So.
That is so good. And I want to just I'm going to go off script just a minute because I want to dive a little bit deeper into this. I've seen in my lifetime people that have been extremely close to me who have stepped into Christian counseling. And you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes because it actually ended up being very toxic and sort of very wrong. But because this person was in such a volatile, sort of broken place, they couldn't see it. So if you have any advice or any sort of red flags that we could share with people, and I am specifically talking about the counselor-counselee relationship, but if you get into a safe person relationship and you're in a broken place and you have a hard time seeing those things that are potentially toxic and dangerous, it has the ability to create even more damage. And I did witness that play out. It created more damage in relationships. And what took a really bad situation just went from to even worse. So if you could talk about that, I don't know if there's actually a question in there, but
I heard it. I think you're stepping around it because you know I'm a counselor. So I don't want to just say there's bad counseling, but warning signs. And I just want to validate that. It's another reason why I became a counselor. I avoided being a counselor because I thought they were weird. No offense to all you counselors. But honestly, I really loved the word. I was called to full-time ministry. But honestly, I feel like God brought me to the next place to say, I want you to bridge the gap between what the word says and how it lands in real time in our humanity. And that is not something that all counselors are concerned about. We're taught a little bit more of a divided life. And there's a spectrum. There's what we call biblical counselors. And those are people that are often just coaching from the word alone, and they're not trained in clinical counseling. So that means they're not licensed by the state and they have no ethics or accountability. Those can be dangerous sometimes because they're just giving you scripture and pray more. And it feels like shame being heaped on top of you because they're not understanding the human dynamics and trauma. Then there's the other extreme. There's the Christian that does counseling, but they're not integrating at all their faith. And they see them as separate. I'm a Christian, but that is not integrated into what I do with my clients. And I think there's a lot of us that are in that in between that are saying, God, use this. And we're keeping in step. Now, not all my clients know God, but I have seen their spiritual journey and they're being drawn closer to who God says He is and who He says they are. So ask around. Don't just go to any counselor off the web. It makes me nervous. There is a truth, though, Holly, that I will say it does get worse before it gets better. Yeah. So there are people around that are going, what is going on with you? But I always think of it like we're digging up the roots from a garden and it had some pretty flowers, but it had a lot of thorns and thistles. And so we just pulled it all up. We're all just looking at it going, oh my gosh, it does not look good. And it's the dead of winter. And so sometimes that's what we're watching in someone's process. And we need a few friends who can hang with us to see the new growth. And many desert people when they're in the process of that. And as counselors are trained to hang in the deep trenches. And many people will quit counseling when everything's in upheaval. So we just pulled up all your roots and now it looks really ugly and you think you're all done. So because it's too hard or it hurts. So I would say if you're going to start counseling, to be committed to the whole process, to do due diligence and really look for someone. I say interview, make sure that your spirit resonates personality wise. Ask them about their faith. A therapist who doesn't share with you about their own spiritual journey is probably more on the divided side. That's not. But someone who's willing to say, hey, here's where I'm at. It doesn't have to influence you, but if you want to, I'd love to talk about these things with you. Holly, does that sit well with you? Is there anything you want to add?
No, yeah, I just thought it was really important because I think personally the thing that I witnessed, I don't think was that pulling of the weeds. I think there was more weeds actually planted that were dangerous and became extremely invasive and were, sort of choking out the flowers that actually were there. Right. And so I just kind of wanted that realization to be had because it can be so dangerous when you're in that broken place and you're willing to go there with someone and you open it up and then all of a sudden you get hurt again. And the last thing you want is to build another layer of that wall. So I'm so glad you were able to speak to that. And I just thank you for that, because it's hard to kind of say that person that was supposed to be trusted didn't do their job right and didn't, help me how they were supposed to help me. So yeah.
It is a huge reason living wholehearted, where we want to be a trusted resource for the church. And so if we can't help people, we always are like, who do we know? We take who someone is as more important than just what they do. So yeah, you might be a great therapist, but I want to know who you are. Yeah. And that is a key factor of a great clinician, again, who's living what they're preaching. And a lot of, like any leader, there's a lot of counselors who give great advice but aren't living by it either, and can cause a lot of damage. So it's like any role. Pastors and counselors are on the same boat in some ways.
True.
Yeah. So I have a follow-up to that, Terra, because I'm thinking about, I actually have two follow-ups, so I'm going to try to separate them. I'm thinking about the woman who is maybe in a situation where she's leading at her church in a volunteer role, or maybe even just in her workplace. And there is somebody that she's leading who is coming to her and opening up. Like maybe she has somebody who is starting to kind of unload the past and the history. And this happens sometimes, I think, especially for women leading small groups, where, you're a small group leader, you don't have any training in trauma, you don't have any training in counseling, but now somebody's telling you like these pretty heavy things. I guess the first part of my question is, how can we best help that person? And when do we need to maybe refer out beyond what's something that we can handle ourselves? That's my first question.
Good. Well, one of the things we talk about in the book, and maybe goes back to something women struggle with, but is knowing our limits and having good boundaries. And I'm really guilty of this, but I know a lot of women come in and going, oops, I got in a little too deep, or I thought. So yeah, that knowing our limits. So I always think, what is the role at hand? Okay, I'm the Bible study leader, small group leader. I'm not even the pastor or the shepherd. Like, what's my job? My job is just to come alongside and to walk with you, and then to hand you to the healers, meaning like Jesus. I'm going to just praying for you. I'm going to keep pointing to the word, but I wouldn't, if somebody is really crying out for help with you as a leader, who God has placed in that role, is maybe you're the connection to someone else. So finding them something, I would ask for help. So if I go to the women ministry pastor leader, or I go to get online and see, or I have a friend who's seeing a great counselor, I call and say, hey, can I get that number? So that might be our role. It's not our responsibility, but it might help us to feel like we at least were a part in getting somebody to some support. But praying for someone and listening to someone is profound. So I just want to say, like, our job is not to fix one another. Our job is to love one another. And it's such a profound paradigm shift. It seems so simple, but there is something really amazing. And if we try to fix one another, it's called codependency. It's a counseling word. I'm always like, oh, it's good conviction for me. But I'm trying to fix you. I'm trying to say, I feel better when you feel better. But what if we just both don't feel good? This is really gross and this is really messy. And I don't feel good, you don't feel good, but we know God's here. Like, that's just such a different place. And then I'm going to be like the friend who lowers you down through the roof to Jesus. And I'm going to take some extreme measures to try to get you some help. Yeah. That can be sometimes all we can do. And then trust that God's going to use that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of times we take on way more responsibility than we need to, or than we should. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. Okay. So the flip side, I'm going to ask the flip side question of this is that, a lot of your book seems to be speaking to me. If I'm reading it, I'm looking at my own life and saying, where am I falling short? Where do I need to close that integrity gap, which is so important. But we might also be in a situation where someone close to us, or perhaps our own leader, somebody that we are supposed to be following, we're starting to see there's a gap there. And maybe we know them well enough to know, hey, what you're saying is not what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
Is this something that we should bring to someone? And if so, how?
Oh, great question. Let me just say that this book goes both ways. We speak about the leaders in our life that have done harm and done well. Like we've had both. And we come out with some really real stories, hard stories of our own life. And when we've been wounded by a leader, we have to be careful because we will keep rewounding others by, again, guarding our hearts and being not trusting others. Like it's a ripple effect, right? That's how the enemy uses it. So we'll now have a gap if we don't address what's going on with the leader that's impacting us. We tell a story. It's early on. I won't go into all the details. You have to read the book. But our first ministry experience, I'm in college still, and my husband was a youth pastor at a church in Seattle. And his boss, the associate pastor, ended up being a professional embezzler, ended up taking all the money. It was our first, welcome to ministry.
Wow.
And the whole time, I remember feeling like, I don't trust this guy. He was doing sermons on integrity, ironically. And there was all these things. Every time he would talk, there was an arrogance about him. He belittled people. There were just these things where I was like, I'm uncomfortable. And I kept internally judging myself. Tara, don't be so judgmental. Everyone else, they must have put him in leadership for a reason. Those are the things we do to dismiss. And what I've learned along the way in all trauma systems and abusive systems is it is our role to speak up if God is showing us something. Now, maybe check it out with a couple people, because we can create a divisive lie. And it could be our own story and our own pain story, and we're being triggered by somebody. We get triggered by all kinds of things, and we talk about triggers and how those play a role. But it is our place. And I look back, I don't hold responsibility for it, but I go, I wonder if I would have said something. So fast forward all these years later, I now say something. I talked to a few people, and it's not my responsibility what they do with it. But in all prayerfulness and gentleness, I go knowing that I could also fall into sin if I'm not careful, as the word says, but I'm going to gently go and talk to somebody who's a safe person who can maybe validate. A lot of times churches will dismiss our concerns, and that is a big red flag. And what happens is, several women say, I'm uncomfortable around this man. I'm not sure and people are like, oh, he's wonderful. And then we find out later he's been sleeping with the whole staff. It's those kinds of things.
Yeah.
It sounds extreme, but it's the stories again and again and again. So listening to those things, praying. And I always ask people to prayerfully consider, Lord, am I supposed to be a part of the change in this system? Or am I being released? Because sometimes we're not a part of the shift, and it's time for us to get out if it feels that unsafe and to not be in that toxic system, especially if you spoke up a couple times and things aren't being addressed. Okay, Esther, what does that bring up for you? Because that was a lot.
Yeah, I think that I agree. I think it is important to speak up. Do you think that there's times where we need to go directly to the person? Or do you think that first we need to, like you kind of mentioned, talking to a safe person to check to make sure that this isn't something like a story you're making up in your head kind of thing? Or do we go to the person that we have a concern about?
Wow, I would love it if you could go to that person, but I would just say realistically that doesn't happen because a lot of us, there's a lot of reasons, right?
Yeah.
Dual relationships and the impact and not wanting to be the one who's giving false accusations. If it's small, go to the person and give them a chance. And I would say it like this, I just been noticing, maybe we're leading Bible study, and I've just been noticing that during Bible study, you're spending a lot of time talking about the struggles in your marriage instead of about the study. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What's going on? And giving them a chance to give you some context, and then maybe be able to say, maybe there needs to be a shift. There's a lot going on right now. Maybe you need to get a break. Things like that might be more direct. But if I've got a narcissistic leader in place, going to them directly is not going to help. Actually, you're going to feel defeated after. So that would be where you need to probably ask one or two other people.
Okay.
Are you sensing this too? And then if that's the case, definitely need to kind of go up the Matthew 18 process.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
So that just brings me, my mind kind of runs wild with that because it's such a risk to say anything, right? Like it feels like such a risk. We hear stories recently of sort of a prominent Christian leader who was doing things all along that people in leadership knew about.
Yeah.
And then finally it came to light. And, these abuses that were happened over a span of time and affected so many people over this broad area. And I guess it seems really baffling to me that there were people in leadership that didn't say anything. And I don't know. I feel as though this sort of mama bear thing comes out in me that I want to protect these people. And so I guess I'm just wondering where you see that disconnect of those people who aren't willing to rock the boat in favor of sort of protecting people in the future, right? You've seen the things that have happened in the past. It's not going to stop unless something drastic happens. And I feel like those are the times that God calls you to be a change maker for the future so that it doesn't happen again. I don't know.
Amen, sister. Yeah. Because here's the deal. It sometimes I'm a grace person. Like I have a capacity for hard and honesty. You tell me anything and it doesn't change my perspective of you. And I think that's but it might change the consequences as a parent, right? Like there are costs for our behaviors, but it doesn't mean your identity and who you are changes. And in the church, we've combined the two. What I do is who I am. And nobody's saying that, but that is the premise as we climb the ladder. And so if you say that I do those things, what? Versus making it safe to say, I'm struggling early on. That's what we're calling for in a greater church reform, to say, we have got to create systems from down at the bottom of the spectrum all the way to the top to say, when I am struggling or somebody is struggling with me, that I can be honest about that and have a process to heal. Not just hide, hold, it gets better. We abuse grace. I was just in Jude today and talking about taking advantage of grace. I think it's Romans, I'm going to butcher it, but all over this morning. And I just go, God just keeps showing me there are those that take advantage of grace, and grace is not to be abused, and it is not soft on sin. It comes from dear friends of ours, the True Face Ministry, and it's such a hard reminder for the church. So we'll forgive and we'll forget too quickly. And when I think about that, I think Jesus he forgave at a high price. Mm-hmm. It's not a quick little, and there's greater systems like the racial injustices and the gender injustices. There's so many things that are happening. Sexual abuse is rampant in the church. And I love the bride of Christ. Jeff and I love the bride. We've seen so much ick. And I'm so grateful that God just keeps expanding my heart bigger and bigger, because a lot of people leave for these reasons, right? Yeah. They're like, sick of hypocrisy. Well, so are we. But God has asked us to be a part of the change, not to leave. And so I'm so grateful our God is big and he can hold these abuses. He can hold where we really messed up. And I think people don't understand that these 15 years of counseling, the primary issue I've been dealing with has been sex addiction and sex abuse. Now, did I go into counseling for that? No, it's the reality of what we're dealing with in the church. And Courageous Girls came out of that passion to say something's got to change. We've got to start teaching these girls to speak up and to value themselves and to discern. I'm uncomfortable with this early, to see my value early, so that when I'm the leader at 35 or 55, sitting at the round table, and I don't speak up, because it's not our fault. And let me just say that very clearly. It's not our fault if we're a victim of somebody's dysfunction and they're abusing us. It's not our fault. And the church will often blame the survivors. Yeah. And so it just takes time, and your mama bear is spot on. I feel like that is the Lord's heart for us. And we sometimes will battle that with, I'm being judgmental, or we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. That one makes me mad, because I'm like, it's true. It's so true. But what does God say? We don't just keep on sinning just because we have license to sin. Yeah. We bring that to the Lord. And so these safe circles, these leaders that we find on the front news or after years, oftentimes didn't have those safe circles. And that is one of those things we started with, and we're probably pointing back to. If you don't got somebody who knows everything and who's helping you to face those things, not just like, I'll pray for you, but who is fighting with you and saying, we're going to do this together. Start praying for that now. Because as a leader, if you're getting more and more influence, all of us could end up on that front page. I always say that, like any of us can be there.
Whoa.
That's the sobriety of all of this.
Right. This is so, Holly, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
We're just like, this is just, this is a huge reason why we started this podcast. Like, because we want women to be able to lead with confidence. And part of that is leading and speaking up when it's uncomfortable and when it's a risk and when people might not believe you. I love everything you're saying. And especially what I love is this concept of having those safe people, and accountability essentially is what we need from the get-go, from the time someone is in a very quote unquote minor leadership role, so that as they grow, that accountability stays and they continue to have people in their lives who will hold them accountable. And I'm including me, so that we will have it as we grow, because I think that is the issue, is once you get into such a high level of leadership, the risk of what happens if people find out is so much bigger.
It is. It's so much bigger. And let me just say that the older we get and the bigger our influence, it feels lonelier because there seems like there's less and less people who get it and less people who can mentor us or who understand. That is a lie of the enemy that tries to keep us isolated. And I've experienced that myself and I battle it. And every time I get to that point where I'm like, nobody gets the complexity of all I'm holding. And, that's a narcissistic continuum. I'll just say that's the voice of that. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, Lord, who? And sure enough, he just blows me out of the water and literally provides another person who's at a different tier or who gets it at a different level. And sometimes we need to have long relationships, people who knew us when. And we also need to be open to building new relationships with people that God's providing here and now. And so as a leader to look, do I have somebody investing in me that I'm not pouring in, that it's just about me? That's where that accountability comes, because as leaders, we'll often flip it and be like, okay, you helped me. Now it's my turn to help you. And we'll only go so far. But you've got to have somebody who really doesn't care whether you stay in your leadership role anymore or isn't connected to the church system. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That isn't wrapped up in what I, as a marriage and family therapist, would say, who isn't in the family and isn't going to be upset when you call out Uncle Johnny was doing that. That's often what we're most scared about, is if I say something, I'm going to lose my whole family. And you might. So that's why you need somebody outside the system who can help you discern sometimes, who gets the system, but who's outside it. If everybody's in your internal system, everybody's in the family per se, that's going to get harder and harder for us. It gets just more complex.
I think we could talk to you all day, but we probably shouldn't.
I love it. Let's keep going.
But I want to wrap up with where you started in talking about wholehearted leaders, because I love that in the book you talk about this and you share that this is your mission to help people be wholehearted leaders. So can you just tell us, as Christian women, what are the keys to becoming a wholehearted leader?
Well, oftentimes we're comfortable giving God our mind, right? We'll study the word and we'll think cognitively about things. Or maybe some of us are more passionate about giving him our heart, but we don't care so much about our mind. And a wholehearted leader is someone who's willing to give God their mind, their heart, even their body, to think about what we're doing with our bodies, our relationships, and all of who we are. A wholehearted leader is someone who's just honest about where they are, and they're trusting God with the consequences. They're obeying and listening to what he's asking and then trusting God with the consequences. It's not a one-time event. This is a process and a journey we're all on. And I wish it was a straight line that just went like straight up, but as we all know, the journey is like these loop circles, windy. Nothing is linear in God's economy. If you see that in the scriptures very clearly. But we do know that a wholehearted leader just trusts who God says he is, even if the circumstances are pretty messy. And he trusts who God says she is, even when the circumstances are pretty messy. And that just takes a lot of being able to clean out, knows our story, we've grieved, we've processed, we're aware, as we talked about, self-aware. So bottom line, I give all of who I am to God, not just parts of me.
I love that. I love that picture of being very intentional with those different pieces and figuring out how you're kind of bent and where your sort of blind spot is, and really working to give God those pieces that are more difficult for you to give. So I love that. So we here at the podcast believe that leaders are learners, and truth be told, we're probably learning junkies. We read all the books, we take all of the quizzes, we listen to all the podcasts. So I would love it if you would tell us one thing you've been learning lately. So that's one part of the question. But then the other part of the question, in the book, you talk about the core values index. And when I read that, I was like, yes, another quiz I can take. Esther has done this to me. I wasn't like this before, but she has really sparked the appetite for those things. So I'd love for you to tell me what you're learning, but then if you could also kind of speak about the core values index and kind of tell us a little bit about that, I would so appreciate that. So I know it's twofold, but
it is. And I'll just say, I am a learning junkie too. I think that's one of the things that I think the three of us are just resonating with. But I'm learning so much right now. I am growing. I tell my friends, I'm going from being, I hope this gets heard the way I mean it, which I preface it with that. But I'm going from being a big fish in a small pond to a small little fish in an ocean, becoming a new author, bringing our message from our small wake that God has trusted us with to now the masses. I'm learning how to do that. And I'm doing it awkwardly. So I just would say I'm learning, and God is showing me, and I'm so grateful and honored and humbled by this journey that God wants to take this message farther than we ever imagined. And that's pretty powerful. So I'm learning in that. I would say core values index. You can get me talking a lot about it. We didn't spend the book on that. It probably is a whole book in itself, but I am a junkie when it comes to assessments as well. I've taken over and been trained in over 21, and all the ones that you guys could name out there. I've been a part of the fads over the years in the church and in the counseling world. And I never jump on any fads. I'll just say that. That's my personality. I just kind of watch them and experience them. But when the core values index came, it was the first assessment that actually clarified some things for me in a matter of seconds. Every assessment says it's the most reliable. But right. I will actually say from the data, core values index is actually 97% reliable, meaning if you take it every 5 years from the age of 5 till 55, it's not going to change very much. Where a lot of our assessments are based on our circumstances. And the highest next to it is the DISC at 80%. So all that to say, I love that. Merchant Innovator. We have some podcasts on our Living Wholehearted podcast if you want to explore it and listen to it. But what I love is it's the most useful assessment in all our relationships. It translates really fast. So from our organizations to our families and our marriages to our friendships. And you don't have to have anybody take it to be able to have it change and bring empathy and admiration for the rest of the body of Christ. It's not a Christian tool. It was based in organizational world, but we see God's fingerprint all over it and have just been grateful to be part of using it. And I would say a lot of people, when they use it, they resonate as well. I know the Enneagram is like amazing right now, but it's a different tool. It's a spiritual formation tool. And I think it needs to stay in spiritual formation. And it's been being used in a wide variety of ways that it wasn't intended for. And as a clinician, I'm always thinking, and I would say as a scholar of the Bible, you can't just take the scripture, a scripture out. You have to use it for its intent. And that's what I would say about the Enneagram. It's a beautiful tool, but it was meant for spiritual formation and your walk with God and understanding your formation, where CVI kind of can cross-contaminate into all of your worlds. And it's just quicker to take on. So you can get the assessment and at livingwholehearted.com and be able to, in a matter of minutes, know your wiring. And you don't have to spend 2 years trying to figure it out.
That will resonate with a lot of our listeners, because yes, we do talk about the Enneagram, but a lot of people get frustrated because it takes time. Yeah. So we like, some people like instant results. So that's good. Awesome. Yeah, that would be Holly. So Tara,
I want to know. I don't want to question. I have enough questioning in my head. I want definitive.
So the mystics out there who love the pondering and slow, the Enneagram is sweet.
Yeah.
But I totally get that.
Oh, so Tara, thank you so much for everything you've shared. We really have enjoyed it. And we're just going to recommend that people pick up your book, The Integrity Gap, Shrinking the Integrity Gap. I'm just going to dive in as soon as possible. So as we wrap up, can you just share with us, how can people connect with you? What's the best way for them to find you online and connect with you?
Absolutely. Well, as I talked about I'm learning how to do social media because I've been hiding all these years as a clinician and trying to be very intentional about my relationships. I didn't get online for years in the social world, but now as an author, it's kind of part of the thing. So you can go to Instagram at Terra Mattson, DM me. I love to meet who God is bringing into the wake of this message. We are calling leaders to join us in the movement of shrinking our own integrity gaps. And so I love to meet other women leaders. You can also go to terramattson.com to learn where we're speaking, about our services. Courageous Girls and Living Wholehearted are there. So those are probably the easiest ways to connect with me directly. And I'm not that big yet where you're going to get, 10 people before you get to me. So you actually get me live if you connect with me.
Well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed speaking with you. And as Esther said, we could talk to you all day long, but we all have things we have to get on to. So I so appreciate your time and thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's such a privilege. I love your hearts and your questions are so spot on. And so thank you for doing this podcast and the call that you both have been called to. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast. And it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.